for the sake of
Vibes.
and the conversation, but vibes, yeah.
Oh, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Cynthia Toledo. I work here in Miami at a place called Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden on a program for students in pre-K through 12th grade.
Hi, my name is Timothy Kirby. I'm a Resilience Program Manager in the Office of Resilience Sustainability for the City of Miami. I'm also a PhD candidate at Florida International University for Earth System Science, focusing on natural resource science and management.
Hi everybody, my name is Paula Manrique. I'm a joint degree grad student here at the University of Miami. I'm getting my JD at the law school and my master's in professional science at the Rosenstiel School. And I'm really interested in environmental policy and resilience planning.
Hello, I'm Shubham Mathur. I studied aquaculture at the University of Miami at the Marine campus, and I'm currently working at a tilapia genetics program in Miami.
Let's get started. Yeah. All right, before I begin and whatnot, hello, my name is Grayson. We are representing the Claremont colleges. I don't have much to say, but I would like to get some pity points by saying that today is Audrey's 21st birthday, and I think that is important in and of itself. So, thank you for pity from Nick. All right, no more pity. All good to go? Cool. Quote, the growth we are going to see in the aquaculture sector over the next several decades is something we can't ignore. We must act now to get aquaculture right, from Robert Jones with the Nature Conservancy. What is open ocean aquaculture, and why is its development necessary and desirable for the future? Aquaculture, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, is the production of aquatic organisms under controlled conditions throughout part or all of their life cycle. Open ocean aquaculture is a specific branch where the aquatic organisms are cultivated substantially removed from coastal ecosystems, and it is different from onshore and coastal aquaculture. Acceleration of open ocean aquaculture development would be desirable. First, what is the acceleration of development? For the sake of simplicity, the APT team defines acceleration as increased funding and support for research, innovation, and expansion of the open ocean aquaculture industry from individual nations and international cooperation based on their own capabilities and marine spatial planning. This funding should come from governments independently, but there should also be a reallocation of subsidies and research money from coastal and onshore projects to open ocean ones. Currently, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that offshore/open ocean aquaculture accounts for around 1/3 of total aquaculture. We also recognize the need to expand food production in a smart way, so we advocate for an expansion based off the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture model, where fed aquaculture species such as finfish, with inorganic extractive aquaculture species such as seaweeds, and organic extractive species such as suspension and deposit feeders are cultivated in proximity. These are basically isolated ecosystems that are able to feed off of themselves. The waste from one animal can feed the waste of other organisms within these isolated ecosystems. More importantly, what does desirable mean? Any desirable change to our production of food will simultaneously reduce contributions to environmental destruction while expanding our capabilities to produce food. The APT strongly supports this desirability for the following 3 reasons. First, environmental regeneration. Second, resource competition. And third, the blue revolution. First, environmental regeneration. Principally, aquaculture can be used to offset pollution and regenerate previously destroyed ecosystems. Aquaculture organized around IMTA, that intertrophic multi-species aquaculture, is an efficient route towards this. IMTA is key for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, from Nesar Ahmed with the German Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Ecology. Anthropogenic climate change is caused by emissions of greenhouse gases, notably carbon from dust particles, fossil fuels, terrestrial ecosystems, and coastal and marine ecosystems known as blue carbon. The greening of aquaculture can help to sequester blue carbon in coastal ecosystems, which is a crucial aspect to mitigating climate change. However, the greening of aquaculture will require technical and financial assistance as well as institutional support to address several challenges. Outside of the principle, there are individual examples across the globe that prove that the efficiency of IMT-based open ocean aquaculture, In Canada, there are ongoing projects in New Brunswick combining culture of salmon, kelp, and blue mussels at several aquaculture sites for the past 5 years. This recycling of aquaculture nutrients led to a reduction of waste production, decreased the risk of algal blooms, and cloudy water around the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture site. Similarly, in the South China Sea, IMTA has enabled farmers to grow 1,500 tons in dry weight of seaweed in a square kilometer with the ability to sequester 500 tons of carbon, which in this 1 kilometer farm is the equivalent of getting 100 cars off the road every single year. If we do not regenerate the ecosystems, then we risk releasing the 1 billion tons of carbon currently sequestered in these blue carbon sinks in both coastal systems, which are having immense stress on them because of coastal aquaculture, and therefore the regeneration would be better in offshore, and we also alleviate the stress by moving more production offshore. Why do we care? At the end of the day, if we allow this blue carbon sequestration to be released back into the atmosphere, we will undoubtedly go past the tipping point and the irreversible damages of climate change will happen. Second, resource competition. Let's be frank, a world with or without the affirmative plan will still have aquaculture in a variety of forms. The unique preference of open ocean aquaculture is that it avoids current issues of competition and overexploitation that we see from onshore and coastal aquaculture. These forms of farming are highly dependent on limited supplies of fresh water and usable land, the same problems we currently see with agriculture throughout the world. This, compounded with environmental damages, means we will see a scramble for any land available and continue to harmfully exploit the environment in this way. There are existing areas that can support deep ocean aquaculture on the other hand. As Global Oceans team researcher Seth Theroukis puts it, high opportunity marine ecoregions are distributed throughout Europe, North and South America, Asia, and Oceania, and they were also identified as having the highest restorative aquaculture opportunity index. At the end of the day, we care about this and we think it is important in the round because we will have a scramble for resources if we continue along our current path, and those resources are finite, whereas the ocean has a much larger supply and would lead to less conflicts in the future, either for geopolitical impacts or for the sake of environmental exploitation. Finally, the blue revolution. As we've already established, the cultivation of aquaculture in some form will be necessary in the future in order to meet global needs for food. This is what some scholars refer to as the blue revolution, comparing it to our initial green revolution, which massively expanded our ability to produce food based on agriculture. We've already proven to you why open ocean aquaculture would be the best way to do aquaculture. But why is development of infrastructure to facilitate the blue revolution necessary? Dr. Hunter Lenahan with the University of Santa Barbara has answered this question for us by saying, quote, "As of today, aquaculturists have gotten this ratio down, 1 to 1. For every gram of protein the fish consumes, its meat offers a gram of protein. That's 100% conversion efficiency. Stellar compared to land-based animal protein sources, where eggs are at 31% and beef is at a measly 3%. This means that the production required to sustainably feed the globe has, at worst case scenario, 3 times the efficiency of our traditional modes of food acquisition. Why do we care? At the end of the day, we can start restoring our ecosystems that have been ravaged by anthropogenic climate change, create sustainable carbon sequestration practices, and feed more people in a world of open ocean aquaculture compared to any other alternative world. A vote for the affirmative is a vote for getting aquaculture right. Thank you.
All right, Grace, I'm gonna start the time now. Just take it. I already got time running. I'm just gonna take a couple seconds. All right, cool. So, you saying your that we must take the time to get aquaculture right? Is that correct?
Yep.
Right. So why open ocean then? If there's other alternatives such as nearshore aquaculture,
Yeah, so we see,
land-based aquaculture.
yeah, so that's the whole point of the second contention about resource competition. Nearshore and onshore aquaculture depend on very limited natural resources, which are already scarce as is. So when we expand these productions to meet food production, it's just going to get worse.
And you talk about geopolitical economic competition as
Yeah.
well, right? So my question is, like, what's the average startup price for like an open sea aquaculture farm?
Yeah, so I don't have an exact number because they widely range from situation to situation, but that's why we advocate for more funding and more.
But the
resources.
lowest is typically at around $10 million, right?
If that's the number, sure. Yeah, again, it's very situationally dependent, and there are ways to do
Are you aware of where most aquaculture is done in the world?
Most aquaculture, as a broad concept, is done in East Asia, but a lot of open ocean aquaculture is done in Ireland because it's not viable for them to do it on their coast, and it's also just scattered generally throughout the world. There's projects all over the world.
Well, yeah, precisely. So typically it's a developing nation phenomenon. 9 of the 10 leaders in aquaculture are in developing nations. So my question to you is, you talk about geopolitical consequences and competition. What does it look like to then take a market that's used for the global south, by the global south, and then move it over to developing north countries like Ireland?
So first of all, I don't think that it is true that the biggest producers of aquaculture are generally from, like, as you define them, as developing nations. Again, this is like mostly seen in East Asia as the current biggest contributor. But even if we want to take that, we think that, giving food sovereignty, because there are examples of currently, like, again, these developing nations that you want to characterize them as doing open ocean aquaculture. So we don't see like a massive shift of like taking away food resources from like poor countries and giving it to the global north.
Well, I have an FAO study that will corroborate my claim. In the countries in Asia that you're talking about are like Indonesia, Bangladesh, which are all like lower income developing nations. But we can move on from the global south point. We'll get into that in our speech. I don't want to make offense in the case. Next question is like this, like you pretty much identified two major harms, right? One is sustainability and like competition over geopolitical consequences and sustainable consequences. We kind of deal with that in our last question. And the next thing is you talk about food supply. What's the goal of expanding food supply?
Yeah, we think that like there needs to be a supply of more food because there's going to be an increase in population.
But what if I was to tell you that like in the United States currently we have more than enough food to feed every American,
Yeah.
but every American isn't fed?
Yeah, so we understand like allocation problems will exist on either side,
Right.
but we also think that there's a chance for food sovereignty in these nations that are traditionally iced out of like international
Precisely,
markets.
food sovereignty. But my question is, like, let's say I don't have an income, whatever nation I'm in. If I don't have an income, this is still private aquaculture, right?
Not necessarily.
So, like, Blue Ocean isn't a private firm, or is it a government-based firm? Like, what is it?
Yeah, we think that there can be a combination of the two. We think that like the nationalization of the aquaculture industry is absolutely something that we encourage nations to do.
Well, I mean, I didn't see you advocating in plain text. But my question then is, if you have private firms that can modify fish, they're not just going to give them to people who are food insecure. They're going to look to turn a bottom line. So my question then is, what does that do to solve the distribution problem, which is the source of food insecurity problem?
Yeah, when we make these things more abundant in supply, that decreases the overall price. We have more food available for people. And we think that even at an absolute worst case scenario, if we aren't solving global hunger overnight, we get millions of people like less starving than would have if we didn't develop this open ocean aquaculture.
Precisely. That's all my time. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Evan.
Okay, I'm gonna warn you guys right now, my alarm is loud and terrifying. And I've had to warn people in previous things, so just be prepared for that. Okay, just a little off-time roadmap. I'm gonna give you guys a couple of disadvantages to open up aquaculture. Then I'm going to give you a counter plan for mitigation. And if I have time, I'm going to give you some rebuttal of the affirmative case. Okay. And I will start my time. Okay, so our first argument, it's you can name this human harming ocean ecosystems. Subpoint A, depleting forage fish supply. Atlantic salmon is the most widely open farm finfish and is carnivorous and has a protein in, protein out deficiency. It takes significantly more protein to feed a farm Atlantic salmon than is produced at harvest. Studies have reported that it requires 4 or more pounds of wild fish to produce 1 pound of farm salmon or other carnivorous fish. To meet the protein needs of their stocks, industrial ocean fish farms rely on fish meal and oil from smaller, lower tropic level ocean fish such as anchovy, herring, and krill, also known as forage fish. In fact, 30 million tons of these fish are caught and processed annually to feed farmed fish. Within a decade, it is projected that the global aquaculture industry will use 2/3 of world fish meal production, and there may already be a serious fish oil shortage. Subpoint 2, negligence and spills. Cook Aquaculture, the 5th largest salmon farmer in the world and the single largest salmon farmer outside of Norway, has its sights set on controlling America's coastline by purchasing its competition. In 2016, Cook was listed as the largest growing seafood corporation in the world. Cook is the principal industrial ocean fish farming corporation in our domestic waterways, with 8 Atlantic salmon fish facilities in Washington state, several facilities scattered throughout Maine's waterways, and many more in the works. It seems as if Cook also may be planning to gain control over additional stages of the seafood farming process. The corporation recently purchased Omega Protein Corporation, which was the leading provider of fish feed. Cook Aquaculture's poor maintenance of a facility in Washington state caused a catastrophic spill of more than 263,000 non-native Atlantic salmon into the Puget Sound and Pacific waters. Cook eventually apologized for the event after first trying to blame it on a recent solar eclipse. However, despite the spill and public outcry, the corporation soon thereafter moved millions more Atlantic salmon fry and eggs into other Washington state facilities, one of which was found to have structural flaws and negligent maintenance. Okay, our second argument. Disease, waste, and emissions. Subpoint A. There are a handful of diseases that farm fish, typically farm salmon, suffer, including infectious salmon anemia, Piscin rheovirus, and heart and skeletal muscle inflammation. Sea lice are documented as the most pathogenic parasite in salmon farming, and in 2016 cost the global industry about $1 billion annually. This cost has impacted the wholesale cost of salmon, which increased as much as 50% in 2016. The industry's primary solution to sea lice is the use of pesticides. Not only do these chemicals kill the sea lice, but they also kill off other vital marine life in the area. And studies show that sea lice are beginning to exhibit drug resistance to these pesticides. Subpoint B. Stuart Bunting and Jules Pretty, Center for the Environment and Society Department of Biological Sciences from the University of Essex Aquaculture Development and Global Carbon Budgets, Emissions, Sequester and Management Options in 2007 said human activity, especially industrial farmed animals, is a lead cause of rising global temperatures, specifically for industrial ocean fish farming. Studies have shown this method of seafood production is nearly twice as greenhouse gas intensive as wild capture fishing, and industrial farmed salmon and more environmentally harmful than other seafood products. Okay, so I'm going to get into our plan text. One sec. Okay. So our plan. Our current plan is essentially we're going to solve their problem, which is their main desirability point is they want to feed more people, right? We say that we are going to be diverting food waste, right? So subpoint one under this. We're going to be subsidizing restaurants and other food providers so that their food that is still healthy to consume be donated to food banks to be distributed by them. There is no food shortage. Regina Anderson, Executive Director of the Food Recovery Network, tells Food Tank. That has never been the case in America. We have so much food. We can throw most of it away, almost all of it away, and still have enough food to feed everybody. It's just a distribution issue. So as my partner pointed out in his cross-examination, just because you increase the amount of food you give people does not mean that this food is going to be distributed. They have not given us a good way or fixing the problem of distribution where we do. So I'm going to give you a list of 5 food banks that, again, if we give them the subsidies that we need, which is in our plan text, they will be able to better distribute the food that we already have to feed the people. So the first one, Aloha Harvest in Hawaii. 1 in 5 Hawaiians relies on food pantries for assistance, yet 237,000 tons of quality food is wasted each year. Aloha Harvest, the state's largest food waste nonprofit, aims to bridge that gap by picking up excess food from donors and delivering it to food relief organizations across Oahu. Since 1999, the group has rescued and distributed nearly 11 million kilograms, 24 million pounds of food. Next, City Harvest in New York. Each day, City Harvest deploys 26 refrigerated trucks to pick up food from nearly 2,500 farms. Restaurants, grocery stores, and manufacturers then deliver that food to hundreds of soup kitchens, food pantries, and community programs. The organization rescues nearly 136,000 kilograms, 300,000 pounds of food every day, and has delivered more than 385 million kilograms to food insecure New Yorkers since 1982. If we solve the distribution problem in the world, period, starting in the United States, we, period, will be able to feed everybody, which, again, is more desirable than their outcome. Because, again, in my speech, that's my time. I'm proud to negate, and I stand for cross.
We all good to go? So, just very explicitly, the counter plan is the subsidization of food banks across the United States, correct?
Yes, food banks, nonprofits, restaurants. Yes.
Okay. Is there anything additional additional to the counter advocacy, or is that the only way that you is that the only thing being presented by the negative? That is a diversion from the status quo.
Yes.
Okay, so that is the extent of the plan. What type of aquaculture does Cook Industry predominantly work with?
I believe open ocean aquaculture.
Okay, because when you talked about Cook Industry being a main provider of aquaculture, the majority of money that comes from aquaculture right now in the status quo is not open ocean aquaculture, which is why we want the development. So I guess what primarily does Cook do?
What do they do?
Yeah.
Essentially, so I mean, they're in the aquaculture business. So I don't really understand your question.
Okay. Could you reread the card you had about Cook aquaculture, because I believe it talked about coastal
Sure.
aquaculture as the main form of production.
Sure. Give me 1 second to pull that up for you. Okay, here we go. Cook Aquaculture, the 5th largest salmon farmer in the world. Do you want me to say the entire thing? Or? Sure. Cook Aquaculture, the 5th largest salmon farmer in the world and the single largest salmon farmer outside of Norway, has its sights set on controlling America's coastline by purchasing the competition.
Okay, and that was controlling America's coastline, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So you talked about how there's no food shortage in the United States, but we both agree that this is about aquaculture on the international scale, correct?
Yes, but America is part of the international stage, so.
Sure. So I guess 2 questions. One, is there a food shortage in the world at large?
I wouldn't know that. I mean, but I'm pretty sure you're gonna give me a stat that tells that.
Okay, cool. And then second, your counter advocacy is still just about the United States, correct?
Starting off the United States, yes.
Okay, so even in your best case scenario, we still see the exact same issues in the status quo in every country that's not the United States, correct?
Well, I wouldn't say that because again, once we solve the food shortage in America, and we're not gonna obviously just worry about that. Once we solve our own problem, we can obviously move on to other nations.
Okay, why are we taking the position of the United States in this round?
Well, I mean, that's like saying why are you taking the role of international? I mean, that's just the advocacy we chose.
Okay, as far as scale goes. And then going back, you mentioned this study from 2007 about industrial farming being one of the biggest polluters. Was that also open ocean aquaculture, or was that the aquaculture industry at large?
I believe that was open ocean aquaculture. But
Okay, could you reread that card again, please?
sure.
It was subpoint B of the second contention.
Especially industrial farmed animals is a lead cause of rising global temperatures, specifically for industrial ocean fish farming. So,
Cool. And then, so with this issue of fish meal production, I guess the question is, there are fish who exist in nature who don't eat fish meal, correct? Like wild fish?
sure.
Yeah, so when we have these systems like the IMTA, where the feed for these fish is not artificial pesticides, it's not artificial fish meal, it is their own isolated ecosystem, how are we using fish meal in the same capacity that currently sees environmental damages?
What was that part of your plan?
Yeah, the IMTA that we talked about at the beginning of the 1AC, the food for these fish are other organic and inorganic materials grown in these isolated ecosystems as opposed to external fish meal. So I guess how are we still using fish meal to the same degree?
Well, again, you haven't completely gotten rid of coastal aquaculture, so that's still one.
Okay, so coastal aquaculture is a problem.
Well, actually, I mean, it's still a problem regardless. I mean,
Perfect. End of time.
Okay, before I start, thank you all for being here and taking your weekends to listen to us argue about things that I'm sure that you spend your careers talking about a lot more than we do. I am also going to give Grayson pity points because he is studying abroad next semester, so this is his last tournament for the year and possibly forever, depending on what call he winds up making. But I just want to say thank you all, and especially thank you to Morehouse. We love you all. We've hit them multiple times before. They're great players. Okay, let's get started. We tell you in our first speech, there is a climate crisis. It is ongoing. There is a crisis of starvation. It is international. What we get from the negative is that they want to redistribute food in the US. Cool, let's do that too. The thing that they have to prove on the negative is that either their counter plan is better by itself than the counter plan as well as our advocacy for IMTA aquaculture in offshore markets, or that they are mutually exclusive. Clearly they are not mutually exclusive. We can fund food banks and also do offshore aquaculture. I think they would even agree with that. They're trying to rest on this argument that they're going to be somehow better than the advocacy that we have about IMTA just by doing food banks in the United States. Again, as my partner brought up in cross-ex, what we're talking about is international food distribution and international starvation. Sure, there's enough food in the US, there is not enough food everywhere. There are many markets that are good opportunities for offshore open ocean aquaculture and IMTA that are not currently being used that could be utilized for increased food sovereignty. This is evidence about Nigeria being a key area for development, which proves that offshore aquaculture can mitigate food insecurity. That's from A.M. Akinosara, who's at the Federal University of Oyo from 2019. The demand for fish in Nigeria is still not met, despite having a domestic production estimated at 800,000 metric tons. The demand still stands at about 2.1 million metric tons a year. To solve this problem, Nigeria has turned to fish importation, where several other policies are being put in place by successive administrations to improve local production. Nigeria is a good site for fish offshore aquaculture. This should be an exclusive duty of the Federal Department of Fisheries, proper policies, provide an overall plan for development, and food security, right? So let's say we do IMTA in Nigeria. Again, we say that governments are going to be redirecting their funding that they're using currently for coastal projects and for onshore fishing to offshore IMTA, specifically open ocean aquaculture, right? Nigeria is a good candidate, it gets more food sovereignty. We can do that and food banks. There's no mutual exclusivity here. If we can prove in any way, shape, or form that we're providing more food to Nigeria, which according to this evidence has a seafood shortage that they're relying on other countries for, that means you're voting for us instantly. I think it becomes a pretty easy call here. Now let me just go back to what my partner said in the first place, because there's one point that is completely untouched. The issue of regenerative aquaculture. They cannot claim to lead to regeneration of any ocean aquaculture or any ocean environment through food bank funding. I think that's pretty clear, right? What we say is that IMTA, this multi-trophic form of aquaculture, allows for no fish feed input. We give the example of New Brunswick. So what this looks like is that they have salmon, they also have blue mussels and seaweed. The salmon produce ammonia and other waste, which feeds the seaweed and the blue mussels. Then you can harvest the blue mussels and the seaweed, turn them into fish feed, and reincorporate them into the system, meaning it is self-sustaining. What that provides for is an improvement on the indigenous fish in the area and improving the biodiversity and ability of these areas to capture carbon. Again, we talk about the issue of blue carbon and how we are almost at the tipping point for extinction on this. What we see is that there's no reason why we should not be engaging in this increased attempt at production and restoration of systems that are absolutely critical for global survival. We need to sequester carbon now. We are seeing drought, we are seeing extinction level impacts, we are seeing floods, especially in the areas that are most impacted by food insecurity right now. What we think is that it's absolutely critical to restore marine aquaculture systems in any way that we can. The plan does that, or at least attempts to do that, and they have no evidence saying that it doesn't. So you should be voting for us just on that. Then my partner talks about this issue of resource competition, which again goes completely untouched. We see growing resource competition and inviability for low-income nations to be able to even own their own coastal areas because of how expensive coastal and onshore aquaculture is getting and how competitive it is with a very small resource. When we move out into open ocean, what that provides for is much more resources. We see that literally only 0.015% of the ocean is required to be used to produce all of the current farming fish. That's the amount of ocean that you need to use. 0.015% of the ocean can be utilized to produce all of the current farm salmon, or all of the current farm fish that we have. That's a tiny amount, right? We still have plenty of ocean aquaculture and ocean resources outside of that, which allows us to have multiple opportunities without this kind of resource competition, which we've seen leading to the disenfranchisement of those who are not able to exploit these areas as efficiently. Then we talk about this issue of the blue revolution. This is the only point that they push back against. They say they're going to somehow be able to feed people better because there's no food scarcity in the US. Great, let's do redistribution in the US. Great, we agree. Food banks, cool. But the thing is, there is food scarcity in other regions. We see that J.G. Pereira from the University of Lisbon says that a world requirement for an annual 30 million tons of aquatic products by 2050 is necessary if we're going to provide for the protein intakes of a growing population. It is not just the US that we care about. In the world, other people's lives matter, other people's access to food matters. And so that's why you're going to be prioritizing us. Now let me just quickly go through the points that they have here. And they talk about Atlantic salmon requiring a lot of fish feed. Again, we provide the example of IMTA and how it can be regenerative. Then they talk about regional spills of non-indigenous fish. IMTA focuses on using indigenous fish to the area and the ecosystems to reproduce, so there wouldn't be that problem of this spillage. And even if there is, it's happening in coastal aquaculture right now, which they agree is bad. Probably minimizing coastal aquaculture's harms on the coast is better. Then they talk about this idea of a disease and communication and conditions. What we see is that with water flow in the open ocean, there's less risk of disease, less risk of eutrophication. So it's just still not better than the coastal aquaculture formations that we have right now that they aren't going to stop suddenly by doing food banks. What we have here is multiple clear reasons that you're voting for the affirmative. The negative says we should do something else that's good. We agree, no reason why we can't do both. Thank you. Open for cross. Or substantially decrease the food shortage, yeah.
So essentially what you're doing is you're just making more fish, right? Or making more food.
Yeah, increasing production in areas where it's needed, like Nigeria that has a food shortage.
But you're creating more food.
Yeah.
What is your mechanism for distribution? Can you distribute this food?
We think that nations tend to distribute food if they own the food.
Again, America owns food. Matter of fact, America owns enough food to feed the world 5 times over, but
America does not know, I just want to be clear, America does not own enough food to feed the world 5 times over. That's just not a true number. If you have a stat, that's fine.
Sure, my partner will give it.
Okay.
Okay, sure. So again, you don't have a mechanism to distribute this food because again, America has enough food, as I gave you the statistic. America has enough food to feed its people, but yet we live in a food insecure nation. So, again, what's the difference between your nation?
Again, the example that we give about Nigeria is very clear that Nigeria is looking for local solutions to increase food production and distribution in that shortage. We see many nations are looking to distribute food, even if the US isn't, and that providing federal funding and grants requiring that this food be brought back to the people is probably the condition that we have for redistributing coastal aquaculture funds at the moment.
Sure. Okay. My partner gave a stat earlier that says that open ocean aquaculture costs about $10 million to start up.
Mm-hmm.
So again, you talking about these poor people that can't really afford to, go into coastal aquaculture, which is much cheaper. Again, how do you expect them to afford this $10 million startup?
Right, so what we see is that with increased research and development, we think that we can decrease the prices, but regardless, $10 million for a startup, again, it's a lot of money for an individual, but it is not a lot of money for a country necessarily. We see that we can build up those opportunities in countries like Nigeria, in countries like Ghana where this has already been happening, to provide for more food opportunities for nations that historically don't have this. Sure, there's a high startup investment cost, but there isn't that same high maintenance cost that coastal has. Yeah, and we can provide international funding. There's no reason why there can't be support.
What is your international funding mechanism?
We think it could come from the World Bank or the UN.
Okay. Okay, and then as far as
And that's in our plain text in the first speech.
Sure. And then as far as my stat about how open ocean salmon farming is causing twice as much greenhouse gassing as regular fish farming, how do you guys solve for that?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about currently is the current corporate production models that we have that are mostly based on coastal and non-regenerative aquaculture. What we are advocating for is regenerative aquaculture, which leads to a net decrease in greenhouse emissions rather than a net increase.
Okay, sure. Are you guys doing fish and seaweed or just fish?
Yeah, fish, seaweed, mussels, other intertrophic levels that are able to have some kind of farming ability to consume each other's waste and provide new food opportunities.
Sure. Are you aware that there's an issue in Hawaii and in other places that seaweed is actually currently killing coral reefs?
Yeah, and the reason why that is because of this hyper-coastal farming and the eutrophication in the areas.
That's actually open ocean aquaculture.
Okay, what we say is that still IMTA is proven to decrease the amount of this kind of excessive growth. We see that ecosystem restoration is specifically predicated on not having an invasive species take over. That's the whole way that it functions.
Well, again, the seaweed that you're growing is not an invasive species, it's the seaweed that you're growing. So the seaweed that you guys are growing are actually killing coral reefs.
Okay, give me the evidence.
Sure.
I'm happy to respond to that in a speech, but if you're just gonna tell me that Hawaii does this offshore and then it causes harms, I mean, that's fine, but we have evidence saying that it doesn't.
Well, unfortunately, that's my time. So I'm excited to hear the evidence.
So I'm gonna start on the next word. The speech not to exceed 6 minutes. Technically, I'm not starting on the next word because I said like we words. Okay, starting time now. So first thing I'm gonna have to do in this debate, and I'll try to be as concise, clear, and organized as I can, is I'm gonna have to deal with framing. Because the amount of abuse that side affirmative is trying to get away with in this debate is quite asinine. And I'll tell you why. They don't duck out of our disads like they like to, because they wanna talk about IMFTA, but they don't wanna talk about all the other forms of offshore aquaculture that are gonna exist. And then secondly, I'm gonna go in and extend my partner's analysis and talk about how these spills actually do happen. I'm actually gonna give you another spill that happened in Macquarie Harbor in Australia that killed even more fish. Then after I do that, I'm gonna tell you why they agree that our counter plan solves, and then secondly, while if they can get access to fish all over the world, we can get access to redistribution all over the world. That would just be the fair ground in the debate. Then after that, I'm gonna talk about why they pretty much like shit on the global south, and we don't do that, and so you should be voting this up. The next thing to talk about then is their whole idea of IMFTA. They engage in only IMFTA aquaculture, which is literally not developed. I've read the article that says it sequesters blue carbon. The author himself literally says, we think it could sequester blue carbon if enough people invest in it in the right way. But what we say is, when you make things large and corporate, and you leave it up to the free market, which they do because they don't have any regulation, they cut corners. And I'm gonna tell you the type of negligence and spills that happens in addition to Cook in Australia. So then that leads me to their so-called delinking out of the negligence and spills. I'm gonna talk about Dr. Tim Dempster in Australia, who advocated to the government, don't accelerate the amount of open ocean fish. He literally said, don't do it. Then they accelerated by 1,000 tons, and then 1.35 million fish died in the sound, and it was untenable. The Macquarie Harbor after that. 85,000 fish died in a single day. They escaped the nets due to overpopulation of the nets. This is the type of things that like large private corporations do to cut costs and profits. They're gonna bite into that harm. They're not gonna be able to get out of it. They're not gonna get these sustainable practices because they are looking for profit. They're also not gonna get people getting fed from redistribution because they don't give a shit about redistributing food. They care about making profit off of food, so they're gonna sell it to the people who buy it. So they don't get any solvency to the environment because they kill ecosystems with these spills, and they don't get any solvency to the food harm for security because they don't actually redistribute food. So then that leads me to the counterplan that actually does. They literally say, we're gonna adopt their counterplan. You know why they say that? Because they know it works. They know free food redistribution works. But what am I gonna tell you? They're absolutely right. It's not mutually exclusive. I'm sure you've heard that we don't have to be mutually exclusive. We just have to be competitive. So if we can show that they like shit on the environment and they shit on the global south, and we don't do that, and we just redistribute food, then you would rather just have the redistribution of food without the negative consequences. So what I'm gonna tell you is, one, aquaculture is in the world at large and is mostly not in the open sea. It's mostly conventional, right? And so what we also say then, secondly, is that it steals a market away from most of the world, right? And so then that'll lead me into my extension of the Global South disadvantage, which is that according to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United States, the FAO, the typical offshore fish farm can range from $10,000 to $100,000 per ton of fish produced. So that's just for a ton of fish produced, right? And then also according to the NOAA, the average fish farm can range from $5 million to $15 million in startup costs, right? The operational costs are $4,000 to $6,000 per ton of fish produced. So when they're producing, like they literally gave you statistics where they said they produce like 200 tons of fish or whatever. Multiply that by 6,000, 4,000. You start to see these ridiculous numbers. And then I tell you about the Global South. Most of these people in the Global South are doing either inland or nearshore fishing. Inland fishing literally means I farm fish in my backyard. Like I just got tanks and I farm the fish in my backyard and I give them feed. this is inexpensive for people in the developing nations. Poor and low income people can participate in this conventional practice. They can't afford $10 million. They talk about Nigeria being a great source for IMFTA. Do you know what the average per capita income of a Nigerian is? It's less than $3,000. They don't have $10 to $15 million to start up a gigantic fish corporation like Cook or like Tassel in Australia. So what we basically say is that they harm the global south. Now, then I have to give you evidence to prove, because Grace was kind of like, bro, this doesn't happen in the global south mostly, so I have to prove it. Okay, so according to Professors Ben Belton, David C. Little, and Simon Rush, in their 2017 article in Global Food Security, not just for the wealthy, rethinking farm fish consumption in the global south, they shattered the commonly held presumption that aquaculture feeds primarily wealthy urban consumers, and that they actually feed for southern consumers in southern markets, right? So a study conducted by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States tracked the aggregate export to domestic consumption ratio of the 10 leading nations in agriculture production. The nations selected, with exception to People's Republic of China, were all low to middle income nations like Myanmar, Bangladesh, Egypt, Brazil, Thailand, for example, the East Asian nations that he talked about. So what we basically say is 90% of the food that's produced in the global south stays in the global south. It's not an export market. So what we say is when they accelerate this large-scale industrial farming and they tell people to wean off of conventional farming, it looks like the people who make a living and feed their populations not being able to do that, because now you just get commodified fish being sold to the richest customers who can afford the for-profit fish. For these reasons, it's clearly preferable to just redistribute food and not do any of the open ocean thing. And I stand for cross-sex.
Great. Okay, so you give an example of a harbor spill. Are you aware that harbors are by definition coastal?
No, okay, I'm telling you, I swear to God, I looked at the video for ABC News. They have cages in the water and they're in like deep in the ocean. It's literally.
Yeah, but cages in the water deep in the ocean doesn't mean that it's in the open ocean. If it's in a harbor, that means it's an enclosed area. And so enclosed areas near coastal communities, by definition in the first speech, those aren't open to aquaculture, right?
I mean, Tassel identifies as an open ocean aquaculture company.
Sorry, where is that evidence?
Australia, in Macquarie Harbor.
Right, but can you read me that piece of evidence where it says that it's open ocean?
I just told you, they have cages in the sea and they have nets that fill fish.
Okay,
That's
great.
open ocean.
So because there are cages in the water, it means it's open ocean. Great. So then you talk about this issue about your counterplan. In your first cross-ex, right, you said that it was just going to be the U.S. as an actor, correct?
No, I didn't say that. I didn't give.
Well, your partner said that, correct?
I don't believe he said that either.
You don't believe that your partner said that the U.S. was going to be the actor?
No, I don't. And also, like David Steinberg has said that this isn't a U.S.-centric debate, so it's a world debate. And you said that too.
That's very interesting. So then why did your partner say, specifically, the U.S. is the only advocacy we're going to be doing? That's a quote.
I'm not sure what he said, but I'm telling you that if you're going to take the world, we're going to take the world. If you can take it or leave it.
It kind of seems like a problem that you're contradicting what your first speaker said, and that your counterplan specifically was for five? You said five? They only give the examples of the Aloha harvest and Hawaiian city harvest in the U.S., correct? Could you read me the text of your counterplan? Sorry.
I don't have it on hand, actually. I just let him.
Does your partner have it?
He might
Could he
have
read
it.
it, please?
You can read it. Can you just read it, bro?
Subsidizing restaurants and other food providers so that their food that is still healthy to consume be donated to food banks to be distributed by them.
That doesn't even sound like me.
Oh, wait, could you read the full text, please?
Yep. There is no shortage of food. Regina Anderson, Executive Director of Food Recovery Network, tells Food Tank that has never been the case in America. We have so much food. We can throw most of it, almost all of it away, and still have enough food to feed everybody. It's just a distribution issue. I give the examples, if I was actually able to finish my speech, of Aloha Harvest, City Harvest, Dreaming Out Loud, Food Forward, and Food Recovery.
Okay, and then the text says that you're going to be funding those, correct?
Those are examples, but yes.
I mean, we're just advocating it. Like, you don't even like tell them where you're funding, what companies you're funding. So it would be unfair burden to then force us to tell
It
them.
would be an
what we're funding.
unfair burden to make you stick with what you said in your first speech, that it was.
Well, you're
accurate.
misquoting him. He said that they showed that in America it's a lot of food waste, but that doesn't mean that we can't redistribute around the world.
Y'all, maybe my brain is fried, but I heard word for word and wrote down the quote, the only advocacy we are doing is in the U.S. from your partner's first cross-examination. I'm just so confused about where the contradiction is
Well,
coming in.
I'm a Biden and say he said that. I'm not saying that. And we say that it's a global debate, and David Steinberg says it's a global debate,
Okay,
so
perfect.
it's a global debate.
And then you talk about this issue of the cost of the startup of fish farming. When's that evidence from?
I believe that was from the NAOO.
Yeah, or what year?
I don't have the year on hand,
Okay, because
but it's gonna go up as
that evidence
by
was
each year.
provided, I believe, in 2007, which was a pretty long time ago, right?
Right, but yeah.
Okay, cool. And then you talk about this issue of how there's no commercial viability with this, and how low-income nations can't do it. Why has China been doing commercially viable
Yeah,
IMTA?
China has the second largest GDP in the world. They're
Right,
not
but
the
how has
low-income
it been
nation.
doing it commercially viably, IMTA decreasing
Because
500?
because they're rich.
Okay, that's time.
Thank you.
I think we have, what,
2 minutes of preparation before I give my final speech.
here we go.
All right, we all good to go? I'm gonna dual wield for this one, see how that works out. Panel ready? Let's make one thing very clear. This round is not about food distribution versus no food distribution. It is not about do we have environmental regeneration or do we destroy the environment. It is about what does aquaculture look like in the future. In the best case scenario of the negative world, in the absolute perfect implementation of these food banks, which I'll get into later, they still have the incredibly damaging coastal aquaculture. And it's funny because they agree with us on this. There is a massive contradiction within their own case when their entire first speech is talking about how the Cook Company is trying to buy up coastal lands and how it's doing a lot of environmental damage and how fish feed is going to ruin us all. And then in the second speech, they tell us that if we get rid of coastal aquaculture, we are going to ruin the economies of the global south, right? At the same time, they have to necessarily either buy on that there will be environmental destruction, which puts us past that point of no return, or they cannot advocate for the food security that they are advocating for. That is their own case. We have had to do no work to say that there is already a contradiction in and of themselves. So, moving on a little bit more. What other examples do we get from the negative case, and how are they either not applicable to IMTA or even open ocean aquaculture at large, or either how they are still continuing to contradict themselves throughout the round? On this point about the Australia example, they tell us explicitly in the evidence that it is a harbor, explicitly not open ocean. If we also want to look at the example of McCoy Harbor in Australia, what they are talking about, it is in a bay. It is in a harbor. It is not open ocean aquaculture, very explicitly. Every single time that they talk about how there are environmental damages, they are talking about onshore aquaculture, they are talking about coastal aquaculture, because that is the predominant way in which environmental damages are being done. And we agree with that, which is why we want to clean it up, which is why we want to give it less money. Now, moving on to the counter plan. They tell us, as they start to sort of shift the goalposts as they move on through the round. In the first cross-examination, we say, is your only advocacy for the United States? And they say yes. And we asked in cross-examination, why are we only taking on the role of the United States? And they responded with the question, why are you taking on the role of the international scale? So, that is how they have defined the round for us. We are taking the role of the international scale because environmentalism affects more people than just the United States, and global starvation sure as hell affects a lot more people than just in the United States. So, again, when they talk about food bank allocation, if they want to allocate food better, we're totally fine with that. Nothing about the counter plan forbids us from doing aquaculture. So then it just comes down to their issues of the disadvantages that they talk about, the things that are not a part of the counter plan. First of all, we need to be very clear and very explicit. A perfect implementation of a food bank will do nothing for environmental regeneration. This is not about can we leave the ocean alone. These are areas where the environment has already been devastated. These are bleached coral reefs. Leaving them alone will not do anything. There needs to be an active way of regeneration, and that has been proven to happen with IMTA and will continue to happen if we accelerate this development and at a worst case scenario, increase research and development. Then they also tell us that we can eventually expand to the rest of the world. Again, they are fundamentally missing the point. When we talk about the blue revolution, when we talk about how the global population will meet 10 billion people by the year 2050, we do not have the food right now to adjust for that, and we also don't have the protein efficiency required to adequately feed that population, even if we have an increased supply, which is why we need to get on the wave of the blue revolution. If we are going to perfectly allocate all of our food, there will still be hundreds of millions who starve because we do not have the capabilities right now in the status quo to meet this growing population. So, what are you going to vote for? At the end of the day, you're going to look at the flow and you're going to look at three things: the environment at large, food security, and whether or not the counter plan can be done absent of the affirmative plan. On the issue of the environment, they have done nothing on offense as far as why the environment gets better in their world. They are functionally the status quo when it comes to environmental protection. Everything they tell us that is against our case, that is saying that we will not be doing environmental regeneration, has largely been either about coastal aquaculture, which we agree should get less funding and have that funding diverted toward other things like open ocean aquaculture. It is in harbors, and it is about fish feed. All three of these things have been explicitly avoided by the affirmative plan because we don't have to just do aquaculture at large and throw a bunch of industrial waste into the water. We can do this in a smart way. We can do aquaculture right. So, on the basis of environment, their best case scenario is the status quo. Their best case scenario is the continued destruction of these blue carbon sinks and 1 billion tons being emitted because this destruction will continue to happen in their world. On the basis of food production, again, note the word production. There is nothing we get out of the negative side, again, outside of the status quo to meet production needs. We tell you there are places in the world that don't have enough food. We give you the example of Ghana. We give you examples of how this has met food insecurity in a lot of places. They tell us in response that some nations are not rich enough as individual people not having enough money. We are not expecting a bootstrap population to pull themselves up and fund their own $10 million farm. We are telling you very explicitly, as we said in the 1AC, that this can come from international funding, and this will come from the governments themselves. And at the end of the day, we can also do the counter plan, but it still does nothing for the environment or for food. It's time to do aquaculture right, or else we will fail. Thank you.
Okay, judges, I'm going to get into some refutation about what the affirmative just said, and I'm going to get into some voters. Okay, my time is starting now. Okay, just to address something that they said at the bottom of the speech. They essentially say that the UN and governments will fund people to solve food insecurity. This is incorrect. What they're essentially saying is that they're going to fund corporations and private funded corporations. And again, these private corporations have no incentive whatsoever to do this for people. They're profit motivated and will sell to the highest bidder, not the food insecure. So again, these people that they're saying essentially they're like giving all this fish to, again, these are private corporations, and these private corporations are going to put this fish on the market. They're not going to give it to the food insecure. That's why they need our counterplan, because our counterplan is giving food to the food insecure. They say nothing about that in their plan. Second, again, they don't refute anything that we say on the Global South. They don't refute anything about it at all, how we say that. Again, they're coming in essentially saying, okay, these people in the Global South, they can afford, to do this, blah, 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 in Nigeria. But we say at the same time, these people in the Global South, right, they're people that do this in their own backyard. So again, these aren't corporations. These aren't, the places that the government is giving money to. They're saying the government in their plan is they're giving money to corporations and things like that. We're saying in the Global South that this market is mostly, people. Corporations don't really run things in the Global South. People fish farm and people do these things in the Global South. So they're not seeing any of that money. And that huge startup cost that they say that, it's okay that, country can afford it, people cannot afford it. What we're saying is people are part of aquaculture in the Global South, not corporations. People in their own backyards are a part of global aquaculture. are a part of aquaculture, not corporations. So again, them doing this is really taking away from their livelihood. They're not going to be able to feed their families. They're not going to be able to be a part of the aquaculture market anymore. And as far as I'm concerned, they're robbing these people of being a part of the aquaculture market. Okay, now going into my voters. Number one, the CP alone is what's most desirable. Again, we look at the fish bills. We look at Australia. We look at again. They want to say that what happened in Australia wasn't open ocean aquaculture. My partner clearly showed you that again what happened in Australia was open ocean aquaculture. Again, 1.35 million fish spilled out. Again, this clearly again hurt a huge ecosystem in Australia. You had a professional tell them in Australia, you guys should not be accelerating open ocean aquaculture, and they didn't listen, and look what happened. 1.35 million fish spilled. And then again, we look at Cook. Again, Cook is acquiring and had a fish bill, and they're taking over the aquaculture market in America, and they're slowly spreading over into other parts of the world. And again, if this negligence happens on their watch now, if they accelerate this and Cook gets more funding, because again, they're funding corporations, Cook gets more funding and they continue to do this, it's not like the practice is going to stop because they didn't say anything really about regulations happening. So they're going to continue to do these terrible things. It's going to be more fish spillage. Okay. Again, I'm going to get subpoint B, I'm going to get into the heating temperatures that they, again, sort of don't really refute. Again, so what do you say from Stuart Brunting? I'm going to repeat my stats. Stuart Brunting and Jules Purdy from the Center of Environment and Society, Department of Biological Sciences from the University of Essex, again say that especially industrially farmed animals is a lead cause of rising global temperatures, specifically for industrial ocean fish farming. Studies have shown that this method of seafood production is nearly twice as greenhouse gas intensive as wild capture fishing, and industrial farmed salmon is more environmentally harmful than other seafood products. Again, so they say that they're solving for greenhouse gas and carbon emissions. That's not true. Again, doing all these things when it comes to their industrializing the open ocean, again, we're going to see these things happen, and we're going to see an intake of greenhouse gas emissions. My second voter, again, we are more desirable for the global south. As I said, again, we're not robbing these people of their market. They are. They're essentially giving the market in the global south to these corporations when these people are the ones that are really running the market. Everyday people are fish farming. Everyday people are part of aquaculture in the global south. And by implementing it on a large scale, you're going to be robbing them of their livelihood. My second voter, they don't solve food distribution without our counterplan. Again, they have no mechanism for distribution. They just say essentially, okay, if we give people more fish, obviously, countries are going to distribute. Again, that's not true because essentially what they're saying is we're distributing this to the market. We're distributing this to private companies. And these companies are just going to sell these fish to whoever buys them. So they don't really solve the problem. They don't solve any problem whatsoever, and they actually take away from people's aquaculture and livelihood by taking away from the global south, which they say they are trying to help. But they're not, because again, these people, if they take away the market, they're not going to have the money to buy the fish that they're putting out in the open market. Okay, my fourth voter. They don't solve the environment. The oceans will deplete so long as we emit boats and factories in open ocean and run on fossil fuels. Again, essentially, they haven't solved, they're still going to have boats coming out and tending to these farms. They're still going to have ships and everything like that. There's the open ocean aquaculture that they're still advocating for still does run on fossil fuels. They didn't say anything about it running green or anything like that. So again, we're still going to see this kind of like what's happening in the status quo about having all these oil tankers and things and ships coming out and still running amok in the ocean, and there's going to be more because they're accelerating it. So again, I want to actually circle back to my third voter again when it comes to the counter plan. Again, they don't solve their biggest desirability, right? And you have to weigh the two worlds. Who is more desirable? Is it more desirable to just have more fish? Because that's really all they're giving us is more fish and more seaweed, and they're not really solving the problem of food distribution, and they're actually, again, as I proved to you in that stat, harming the ecosystem. Or would you rather have a plan where we, again, since they have global advocacy, we have global advocacy, a plan in which we can globally actually give people back food. And in America as well, as a starting point, we can give people back food. There's a mechanism in there that we give you that actually distributes the food and solves food distribution. So these are actually going to the people who are food insecure. Versus them, they're not doing that. They're just putting more fish on the market and selling it more to more rich people who can afford it. So again, you have to weigh in this round which world is more desirable. And we say on this side of the house, the negation is the more desirable world. Thank you.
I opened my mouth, so I guess it has to be me. First, let me say thank you to Claremont. We did want to offer feedback and notes and just comments if you all are open to it. And I'll go first again because I opened my big mouth. Once again, my name is Cynthia Toledo and I work here in Miami at a place called Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden. And I work in the education department. And that's 20 years of experience in the education department. So like that's the lens that I'm doing the debate from. The thing that I really appreciated about you all from Morehouse was that like I could follow along with your arguments because your conversational style, and it just was easier for me to understand what you were getting at, and like whether or not I agreed with your argument. I really like I didn't have to like stop and think about what you were saying because it was very clear to me and very like for every person, and I feel like could understand your arguments. And so that's what I came into civic debate not knowing anything and thinking, so this is for all of us, like for the people, this style of debate, and I feel like you all really like hit the mark on that. Claremont, you all made amazing arguments and you gave great information, and just as a non-technical person, I just really had to be like, okay, pay attention to what you're saying, like make sure you remember your numbers, make your notes, because I'm not gonna like remember the gist based on the detail. That's not a negative thing, that's just me and like how I'm coming to the room. But once again, thank you so much. It was really great.
My basis, I work in government. And I'm also a PhD candidate. And so my background research, spans across the globe from Kenya and Brazil, where I focus on agricultural issues, anthropologic studies, as well as, also looking at that food, energy, like water nexus. My research goes into other areas, but I'm my very basis of understanding for that. One of the big things that I really liked, was how clear and concise Claremont was in terms of their argument, and how they hit one point, next point, this point, that point, and it was well researched. For Morehouse, your argument or the arguments that you made were very, very good. Where you're talking about that is a resource allocation isn't not a it's not a resource number, but an allocation issue. That is very true, because we do have, for example, even when you're talking about, for example, the global south, half of the food distribution that goes on is actually feed to go to other countries in the global north. And so I just wish that you would have done maybe just a little more research on the allocation issues across the world, because yes, it is a global issue, and unfortunately what tips the scales was that moment where it was US versus the world, and there was that shift that sort of happened. And because of that, that what kind of made me go okay, well, did you do your research about allocation issues and what food production is happening around the world and how that drives food insecurity? And I didn't necessarily get that. And so it was an aspect of, a layer of research, where it wasn't your argument was, to me, sound. It was a level of research, and they were clearly more research, and their argument was more well crafted, in responding even to your question and cross exams.
Thank you guys so much for doing this on your weekend. I really enjoyed listening to you guys debate. I'll start with Morehouse. I really liked all of your guys' arguments. Similar to what Cynthia said, I felt like you guys were more personable. All of you guys are really good at projecting your voices, which is really important for this sort of thing. I know, I love how you used your hands when you were talking, because it made everything so much more engaging. And I know that you guys have a lot of information that you're trying to get out very quickly. And so it's kind of inevitable to look at your computers, but overall, I think you guys all had really good eye contact. I feel like what was missing from the Morehouse side was you guys had good counters, but I wanted to hear more about exactly why your plan was better, and I feel like I didn't get that. And then for Claremont, my biggest thing is I feel like your biggest justification for accelerating aquaculture is the fact that the fish stocks are depleting and illegal fishing is the biggest problem that we're dealing with right now. And no side mentioned that. And I mean, that's just coming from my environmental law background. I think that would have really helped like just supplement your guys' thing. And as for decorum, so I'm a law student. I want to be a litigator, and I'm gonna tell you guys right now that rolling your eyes and not keeping a poker face, it takes away from your argument. I asked Timothy, because he did debate in high school, and I said, how are they taught to handle that sort of thing? And he said that, you give it a little bit of weight, but not a lot, and I understand you guys are learning and your students. It's something that I've also struggled with as a law student. But if you want to go to law school and you want to litigate one day, start working on it now, because it takes away from what you're saying and it's distracting. But overall, it was really great to hear everybody.
Congrats to both teams for making it so far. It's really awesome that you guys are competing at such a high level. But again, I'm an aquaculture professional in Miami, so it's really interesting to hear both sides of this particular debate. I really appreciated how you guys were so kind of friendly and conversational, and it made me think that if I was a lay person not familiar with the debate at all, it would be really easy to kind of follow along with you guys and just kind of make me want to hear more about what you're saying, if that makes sense. Because again, we are not on average a lay audience. We're professionals in our various fields and stuff. But if you're doing this debate in a town hall or something like that, that kind of conversational attitude is a huge boon for you guys. So kind of work on that, because it's really in your favor. And for you guys, I really appreciate how strongly you guys researched the subject, being able to have counter arguments ready for the questions. It seemed like you had those responses ready before the questions were even answered or were even asked. So I appreciate how knowledgeable you guys have become about the subject matter. Congrats to both teams again. This was really a lot of fun.